Satellites may be going flat, but profits are up. Rocket Lab wins a large contract from the United States Space Force this week to build flatsats for Neutron. And that's not even the biggest award this week.
Shots fired this week at the moon. A Falcon 9 second stage impacted the moon with a 60-foot by 12-foot crater. We'll just have to wait and see how the aliens retaliate.
Where are the other drugs at? Turns out they're in space, as Redwire signs the first commercial in-orbit biopharma contract for the recently debuted Starfall.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Space Times Podcast. As always, I'm Paul Mayer,
Here with Harrison Lambert.
excited to share this week's space industry updates with you. We hope you enjoy the episode. Subscribe to our newsletter if you want the written breakdown of our episodes emailed to your inbox every Monday morning. Drop us a comment on our LinkedIn or Blue Sky with anything you enjoyed or would like to see. And as always, listen weekly on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Substack, or wherever you're receiving this signal. Leading the show, the U.S. Space Force has awarded Rocket Lab a hair shy of $400 million to develop, launch, and operate a constellation of flat-stacked satellites under the Space-Based Airborne Moving Target Indicator Program, SBAMTI. Now, AMTI is something that we spoke about last week as it came up in the context of Array Labs and it came up in the context of national defense. But this award in particular is part of a $615 million three-firm package. It's funded through the Other Transaction Authority, with Systems and Technology Research, or STR, being the other named entity. Now, the third named entity, it's not like they're still defining or deciding who that's going to be. There's no bake-off. It's a already determined customer. It's already a determined partner. Their name is not being disclosed for security reasons. But it's really interesting to see Rocket Lab developing these sort of flatelites or flat-stacked satellites technology. This is one of the big value adds that Pat mentioned regarding Samara Aerospace's MSAC technology, effectively being able to develop satellites with really robust control and actuation abilities that don't have to rely on the volumetric constraints of traditional ADCS equipment, like your momentum reels, your magnet torquers, what have you. But I'm really interested to see how Rocket Lab plans on solving that system design challenge. Though the AMTI use case, like I said, is one that we've seen some momentum for. So I'm not particularly surprised to see Rocket Lab getting this sort of award and getting this momentum.
Yeah, it's definitely it's a couple of interesting trends. One being this moving target indicator kind of application becoming more in demand. And, to the point of last week, we saw it a couple of times. It's been a couple of months where these contracts keep popping up. I feel like it kind of kicked off back in May when SpaceX won $4 billion for their MTI solution. That's not to say that this hasn't existed for a while. Like, most of this reads like missile tracking technology. I know they call out like aircraft and boats and other moving targets as well. But it seems like most of the money would probably go towards like missile tracking, or that would be the most valuable aspect for it.
Oh, 100%. This is absolutely about missile tracking.
Yeah, but it's interesting to see it use a multitude of different technologies, because historically, I know you've mentioned this a lot, like missile tracking is largely infrared effort that usually catches the fire planes from initial launch, and that's like earliest detection. But we're seeing things for like SAR as well as traditional visual optics. So just a variety of technology, and it's interesting that it's showing up in a variety of different companies. I mean, this does kind of, in my opinion, mirror the SpaceX award. Granted, SpaceX's was for 10 times the amount of money, but Rocket Labs, their rocket still hasn't launched. They're a smaller company, but this is still a huge win for them. I think it bolsters their satellite production, which that's a majority of their business. So that's great for them. And we've seen them make a lot of moves to move more towards a volume production of satellites rather than their more bespoke kind of satellite foundry that they've been doing. They bought Iridium. They plan to make their own constellation. This will be a government constellation that they have to build. So another step towards them kind of creating more scale production, which I think is great for the maturity of Rocket Lab. The other aspect here is that flat pack design. It's something we've seen for a little while, mostly with Starlink. but it's not something that's been widely adopted by the industry. You know, we've talked about a couple of other companies that are doing it, like Eclipse Space just came out of stealth and is doing something very similar, but it's basically a derivation upon Starlink. Last week we talked about Meridian Space, which is much the same way. They're kind of flat packed pieces that get assembled in orbit. For them to go this route for Rocket Lab is kind of interesting. You know, I think Aerospace Lab also kind of made a stake in the ground here when they did their DiskSat demo a few months ago. I didn't think it would be as much of a kind of a harbinger for this trend as it seems to have become. But I think there is a push more towards flat packing stuff. I think it's a good push because it gets us away from this origami style kind of packing efficiency. But it does feel like it's pretty late in the cycle for this to start being a thing. Like we're getting towards rockets that are so big, we don't have to worry so much about packing stuff in efficiently. At the same time, that flat pack is becoming very popular.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I wanted to hit on a couple of things here. One, that this contract is specifically designed for the flat sats to launch on Neutron, not on Electron. So there's like Rocket Lab, you mentioned they haven't launched their vehicle yet. The vehicle in question is the Neutron rocket. So they haven't actually gotten that up yet. So this entire contract is predicated on Rocket Lab's ability to get Neutron airborne and functional. Neutron is basically a one-to-one sort of capabilities comparison with the Falcon 9, and I think also the Falcon 9 Heavy. But that's sort of the class of satellite that we're working with here. And secondly, to your point, we are pretty late in the cycle for the Falcon 9, we'll say the Falcon 9 sort of asset class and launch vehicle capabilities. So it's interesting to see Rocket Lab coming to the party late, but coming to the party while now optimizing volume in their fairing, optimizing the volume of the payloads that we're seeing, because the overwhelming sort of tailwinds that we're seeing in the launch market is this shift towards much more volume agnostic, much more sort of loosey-goosey on the volume size of things. We're putting everything in our swap into power, which really, I mean, that's the only way you're going to be able to hit a lot of the power targets and a lot of the orbital compute needs that we're seeing coming out of these massive orbital data center players. But it's interesting to see Rocket Lab sort of going against the grain a little bit here, focusing much more on the volumetric efficiency, on getting as many of these flat-packed satellites into their fairing as possible. You know, maybe that's more a reflection of Rocket Lab trying to reach parity with SpaceX's capabilities, because to your point, SpaceX has done a pretty good job of optimizing their own assets for volumetric launch in the Falcon 9, more so than it is a reflection of Rocket Lab thinking that that's where the sort of external industry is going, where a lot of their customers will be headed. But it is an interesting sort of an interesting almost conflict there.
Yeah. And as to like how they're going to flat pack it, a lot of these designs, and most of it's just from renderings, so there's only so much you can tell. Like the thing that seems to restrict it the most is that attitude control aspect. Like if you look at Starlink, it's not completely flat. There are still reaction wheels. They're just canted at a way that they only add so much thickness to it. That seems very similar with DiskSat, although their reaction wheels aren't as visible. So theirs almost seems like they have a gimbal thruster to kind of give it that out of axis control. So yeah, I think depending on the application, you can get away with not having as much attitude control capability. I'll just be interested to see like what design they come up with if they're able to get away from using large reaction wheels, because the lower the cant angle, the less attitude command authority you have over those out of axis kind of controls. So
sure. I mean, I'd imagine that for moving target tracking of airborne objects, I'd imagine that accurate determination, control, and pointing is going to be pretty important. But you know, maybe the thought process is sort of get enough assets up with sort of a wide enough field of view that you're able to effectively, even if things are only 80% accurate with their pointing, that you're able to cast a wide enough net to still cover everything that you want to.
Yeah, and I mean, it is a good trade-off to get rid of reaction wheels for those kind of applications because it's more stable. You have less jitter, but it's more like they're useful when you need a point. But if you're just staying nadir pointing, like you don't need huge reaction control authority. So they might be able to get away from that quite possibly.
Meanwhile, a little bit further north, Canada's Defence Investment Agency has awarded Telesat a 2.3 billion Canadian contract, a 2.3 billion Canadian dollar contract to expand the Lightspeed constellation. It's a constellation of 156 satellites that's going to grow to 225 with assets built by MDA. This is all part of the Enhanced Satellite Communications Project, most specifically with the polar aspect of the program, the ESCP key program. Like I said, this is an extension of an existing contract vehicle. They're growing the number of total LEO assets by 69. This contract extension further extends MDA's contract with Telesat by another 475 million Canadian. The 15-year contract between Telesat and the DIA includes 2 5-year option periods, each of which is worth roughly 200 million. So the total potential value for this contract is a 25-year contract valued at roughly 2.7 billion. What I think is most interesting about this is that it indicates a big trend that we've seen, that Canada is effectively mimicking and following in step with the ESA and the EU, much more so than they are either of their or any of their other sort of North American neighbors or partners here. But Canada is spending big for space sovereignty. They are really pursuing launch, manufacturing, operation, and deployment capabilities locally to the best of their ability. They continue to partner with European nations and with European providers, building up those capabilities. This contract very much reads as a continued prioritization of SSA and SDA as one of the core components and core inputs for national security and for effectively defense. So we're seeing this almost globally, but the push for sovereign capability simultaneously with the push for national security, and I think that this represents a sort of continued trend of Canada seeking independence from U.S. launch, seeking independence from U.S. manufacturing, and willing to partner much closer with European allies to achieve that.
Yeah, I like how hard you tried not to say PP at the end of that program name.
Thanks, man.
I would have gone safe and just said ESCP-P. I think that's intentionally why they put that dash there. Yeah, I think the other interesting thing is it does mirror kind of the trend we saw with IRIS² constellation in the past couple of weeks. Last week we saw Spain spend a little over $1 billion putting their national secure communication satellites into the IRIS² constellation. Late last year, there was talk about Telesat kind of kickstarting the IRIS² constellation. This was kind of intended to be the first pass at that. And the way we've seen IRIS² played out, it is very much like a amalgamation of different satellites to form their own sovereign communications constellation. So, this seems like Canada putting up their stake in kind of building out IRIS². And this additional funding, very similar to Spain, is to increase the spending on secure communications as a portion of that constellation. So, IRIS² is meant to be kind of just a generic communications constellation, but there's increasingly funding for making a secure portion of that, which, very closely mirrors Starlink and Starshield, which is the main constellation that all this money is being put to, separate themselves from. They want an alternative to a U.S.-owned communications constellation. So it's a lot of money being put towards it. It has a pretty long timeline, but it's good. I think the money will help speed it up. We see this with a lot of different constellations. Once this kind of funding gets put into it, timelines start picking up pace. So it's good to see all these stakeholders putting money where their mouth is, contributing to the effort. IRIS² seems like they're committed heavily towards actually deploying this capability. I think MDA is a perfect partner to kind of take charge on a lot of this. We've talked a lot about their skill at radio communications. So this is right up their alley. That will certainly help with their payload and making it actually competitive, because we've seen with some communications constellations being kind of behind the curve on that capability as stuff is improving rapidly. So hopefully, MDA can be kind of cutting edge with what they end up deploying with Telesat.
Moving a little bit closer to home from some of the altitudes we've been discussing so far, Creos Space, the Spanish startup, has announced the planned flight of their first VLEO satellite, boasting the first air-breathing electric propulsion platform launched into orbit. They announced a partnership with Kongsberg Nano Avionics using their microsatellite bus, the MP42, which is roughly 200 kilograms. And this inaugural mission will involve using an optical payload, their ABEP platform, and the Kongsberg Nano Avionics bus to take sub-meter resolution images in the visible and near infrared range, VNIR. And their goal is to prove out the technology, show that everything works for sustainable longer-term missions in the 150 to 300 kilometer altitude range. Now, for those of us who don't know, the ISS orbits at 450 kilometers plus or minus. That's more or less considered the very bottom edge of LEO. This is substantially below that. And because of the way that physics works, a lot of the needs and a lot of the requirements scale more than linearly with altitude and with range. So by cutting altitude in half, you're able to effectively cut power for certain applications by a factor of 4. So VLEO, the big challenge, the big reason why it's never worked is because the constant energy, the constant power needed to overcome the drag at an altitude that low has outweighed any sort of benefit that one would get. But if that's a problem that you're able to actually solve, that opens up a lot of doors for much more close Earth missions that would involve some pretty unique architectures and some pretty unique capabilities. We've seen a lot of different players looking at working in this space, including Redwire, including Viridian, including a multitude of companies. But it's great to see Creos getting some traction here, though. No, from what I've seen, there's no actual official date for their mission launch, which means that there's going to be a lot of folks sprinting to be first here.
One of the things that kind of stood out to me here is that Kongsberg Nano Avionics has a really flexible bus. Like the MP42 just keeps popping up. It's pretty understated because most people don't want to say that their bus was built by somebody else, but there's a lot of satellites out there that leverage this platform for their design. So, recently we talked about them with Meridian Space. It's not the MP42, but Kongsberg, actually neither of these examples are, but, Kongsberg has a wide variety of capabilities. They're a satellite manufacturer and developer. We talked about them with Meridian Space because they designed that unique flat panel kind of design for it. They've also worked with like Kepler for some of the payload integration stuff. So just a really impressive company, and seeing them pop up again, especially using this MP42 platform, because it is not meant for VLEO. It is like a standard small sat bus used for a lot of LEO applications. So the fact that they can fly this in VLEO is impressive. Nothing about the structure or the components should really preclude that from happening. If it really is, they just slap on an ABEP solution and this thing can fly at a lower altitude. That's pretty impressive on its own right. That's not even like putting it to the point that like Creos flies this thing and it works. That's awesome because it's the first ABEP to fly ever. And there's, like you said, there's a few companies working on it. Viridian, Redwire, Nordspace is another one we've talked about recently. There was one out of India as well. I think it was like Take Me to Space or something. So really interesting to kind of development. I know we've talked about it a lot with VLEO being like, people want to move out of LEO. It's getting too congested. There's benefits going to MEO or going to VLEO. And it's cool to see a lot of people kind of leading this charge because there's not much demand there yet. They're kind of creating the demand for it. And I think that's what they called out in their article is, they want to launch it soon, but they're waiting for like the demand to arrive. I don't know, really like that phrasing, but they are roughly targeting 2027. So it sounds like whether or not it arrives, they're going to launch anyway. It's just, they're hoping that maybe they're not spending money on something that might not work. So definitely cool technology. I think it's a very emerging trend. Very visible near and infrared imaging is, I think, a good use case for it. I do like the communications use case for it better. And I feel like visible, you kind of get those trade-offs of like higher resolution, but lower swath width, which I don't feel like is a good trade-off because you can see higher visibility at LEO and MEO and GEO. It's the same trade-off though. So there's not really a huge benefit to this. Like most of the lower limits of resolution are just regulatory restrictions, not technical ones. So I feel like there's better applications for a VLEO platform. Near infrared's good. There are limits on how high resolution you can get at distances with infrared. So I think that's a good application, but I would like to see higher wavelength infrared imagers like mid-wave or long wave, because that's where you'd really get a benefit from that. So, comms, SAR, I think those are better applications for this. Infrared, also good. I'm just interesting that this is the first use case that they're going with.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that the use case they're going with now is just because of the simplicity of the payload that they're able to use. Kreos is not designing the payload themselves. Their key contribution here is the air-breathing propulsion method, which is really what this is all about, just proving that out. I think that the use case for VNear is much less compelling than the use case for communications, more specifically. I can also see SAR being really valuable, but I would agree with you that they're likely going to do that. And to your point, Kongsberg isn't going to be necessarily just giving them and selling them one of their MP42s off the shelf. Kongsberg is going to be working with them and customizing the bus a little bit for this unique mission's needs. Because to your point, the MP42 is effectively sort of a standard off-the-shelf LEO bus, and so they will need to make some modifications for it for this unique mission. But for the most part, there's a small amount of non-recurring engineering work that needs to go into this relative to designing another bus from the ground up.
I think the company that's taking a better approach to this, I just want to point out, is like Nordspace, because they're doing a VLEO bus as well, but they've done it through their rocket program. So I don't know. I just feel like that's a good model to follow, because they invested in Wyvern, which is an infrared imaging company, good payload for the satellite they want to build, which is a VLEO bus, which will launch on their rocket, which they still haven't launched their first version, but their first version is going to be lower altitude, lower mass. I feel like they have a good idea of how all these tech play together to create a unique offering. Kreos, to their credit, ABEP on its own is difficult. It's good to outsource some of the satellite design to Kongsberg. I just feel like they need a partner for the payload to get something more out of it. Like Redwire has DARPA. That's cool, but that's DARPA, so it's advanced tech. I feel like Nordspace has the best commercial vision for how to kind of create value out of VLEO.
I don't disagree with that. I think that Nordspace, bigger picture, I think Nordspace is more focused on a vertical play here, vertically integrating and including all of the capabilities that they need. They're targeting sort of the VLEO lower altitude market, VLEO and LEO, with their launch vehicle, with their bus, and with the payload that they've sort of, all of those capabilities they've been building and acquiring in-house. Whereas Kreos is much more of a at this point, they're much more of a component specialist, effectively sort of enabling this for the rest of the industry. So I would argue that Nordspace represents more of a vertical strategy, and Kreos represents more of a horizontal strategy, which I would agree with you that at this point in the industry's cycle, I think that the vertical play is probably a little bit more likely to succeed in the intermediate, short to medium tier future, though. Kreos could certainly wind up sort of winning the horizontal, but to their point, they're kind of trying to wait for that actual market demand to materialize. So they may wind up sort of winning that horizontal layer, but that may take a little while longer to materialize and come to fruition. Moving back to the Bay Area, Nornir Space came out of stealth and announced their AI-based satellite architecture platform. In so many words, mission requirements go in and spacecraft architecture comes out. The tool boasts the ability to translate mission goals into structured systems requirements and an initial spacecraft architecture, and will sort of check against physical limitations and validate the design and architecture being leveraged. The platform claims to take the initial design cycle from order of magnitude weeks to minutes, and is a really interesting concept that we haven't yet see play out in the industry. either in space or I guess more broadly. We haven't necessarily yet seen this play out, but it's interesting to see this same sort of pattern of agentic AI workflow and this effectively sort of AI expertise tool entering into the spacecraft and satellite engineering industry. I'm super curious to see who Nornir views as their beachhead market and who they are targeting for their sort of initial adopters and customers. I think they're probably going to I think they're probably going to learn some of the same things that we heard Alex share last week from VXB, that a small sort of share a wallet purchase is actually going to wind up being a little bit easier with a medium-sized customer rather than sort of a really small startup. So I'd be curious as to learning sort of where Nornir sees that core, like, hey, these are going to be our first 5 customers, and this is how we're going to grow and really stick the landing.
Yeah, I feel a little torn on their approach because I liked VXB's approach because it was more focused on the component level engineering feature, which I feel like that's a good use of AI because it can generate new ideas very well. And you end up kind of locking in the design a bit more than you do with a spacecraft architecture. So you really, like, one of the things with AI is it doesn't really have memory. It has to spin up every time, which I feel like kind of puts it in a better position to kind of do some of that early engineering. And then it's kind of done. With an architecture, a lot of the hard work is just maintaining it as requirements shift over time, which I feel like is not as good of a fit for AI. You know, maybe you can have agents that kind of maintain requirements as things change, but you're going to have to be pulling in stuff from lots of different areas. And it's going to have to be deployed across the whole stack. And you know, this is constantly evolving thing. And I also feel like it doesn't work. Like, there's something that's more on the other side of that, which is companies like Oligo Space or Proteus Space, where they're using AI very heavily in the full design and production of their satellites. So it's very integrated into their whole product offering. I just feel like Nornir Space's approach kind of falls somewhere in the awkward in between and might run into more struggles with just kind of the nature of having to work across so many different domains with so many people and just evolving needs. So if it works, I think it's great. There are a lot of companies that are working on improvements to systems engineering, but I think almost all of them are focused on AI as a tool for better systems practices. This seems to be working more towards the goal of an AI that can do the whole systems design. So definitely a challenge. I think it will be interesting to see how it kind of integrates into other people's systems, how it plays alongside other AI kind of tools like VXB on the component side or things like FlowSpace on the systems tools side. I would be surprised if they don't end up moving more towards a production style company, kind of like Oligo, to have some more of that control. Because that was really interesting in our conversation with VXB, is that they have a hardware lab where they build a lot of this stuff in order to test it, in order to improve their models. I feel like Nornir will have to do that as well. And that's why I think, you know, companies like Oligo and Proteus have that advantage of, like, they build the thing their AI develops, and that helps train it for better systems in the future. So this week we have a few more setbacks. I know last week we had a few unfortunate events as well. These kind of are across the range of different sectors. So we have one coming out of EchoStar. Their Hughes Network subsidiary has filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy to protect them from a $1.5 billion debt that came due this month, August 1st. So EchoStar, big, large incumbent Geocom company. We talked about them a couple months ago when their Dish TV subsidiary filed for bankruptcy as well. And we talked about them before that when they sold their spectrum rights to SpaceX for something like $19 billion, which at the time was kind of crazy. Like, that's a lot of money, and nobody had really been buying spectrum at that scale yet. And, you know, it was like, well, what are they going to do with all that money? And it turns out they weren't going to spend it on any of their struggling subsidiaries. You know, a lot of it's in stock, so they couldn't, but a lot of it was in cash. And it is surprising that they're not using it to keep some of these subsidiaries alive. I'll let you get into some more of the financial details, because there's a lot of numbers here as to, like, they're making money. It's just they're kind of divesting away from the things that are costing them more money than it's worth to kind of continue operating. And, you know, a lot of this is the trend we've been seeing for decades now, which is big prolific geocom providers are falling out of favor for more LEO providers. I think on the other side of that, the consumer demand side of things, like these companies were depending on old cell technology and old TV technology. Now we have streaming and we have mobile networks and all this other sort of technology is kind of leeching away that demand. And I think the newer companies that are kind of emerging and operating in lower orbits with newer technology are able to better capitalize on that. We've seen lots of these older incumbents try to pivot. I know we were part of it with SSL. And it's just really hard for them to do, especially saddled with all that debt. It's really hard for them to pivot.
Oh, yeah.
And I think we're seeing that as like a lot of them, like SES and Viasat, they're starting to rely heavily on newer companies that they're able to partner with and kind of pivot in that fashion. But I'm most curious to kind of see how, when all this settles, what these old school space companies are going to look like, because it's not the same model that they've been operating on since the 80s.
So like first and foremost, I think you hit the nail on the head. The reality is that the global landscape for the ultimate customer for a lot of the incumbent geos has just changed. It is a night and day difference. Television, media, communication is simply neither consumed nor solved in the same way that these companies have been built and designed from the ground up to solve for the last 50 years, right? So just big fundamental, that is hard. The ground is sort of shrinking beneath them. And so as a result, these companies are effectively needing to divest from the shrinking industries. So EchoStar, rather than investing in the companies that are effectively losing business and sort of sunsetting, makes perfect sense that they would sort of let those companies and those business lines sunset on their own. This type of pivot and this type of strategic and product change for a company is always going to be a difficult one, especially if the company is really big, especially if the company is doing something that it has done for a long time. One of the things that I liked to say when we were at SSL was that I was working a job that, I'll say 50 years ago, one needed a PhD to work. And now that work was being done by somebody without a PhD. Largely off the back of sort of this almost tribal knowledge, but we just called it our heritage data. But just the sense that, hey, this is how we've always done it. This is how it works. This is what we do. Once a company has been around for a long while, a lot of the folks working there tend to rely on everything that has always been done. And you can see this in countless different studies. That doesn't change in the space industry. So a lot of these companies are going to have difficulty pivoting and changing because they have so much heritage, expertise, and knowledge on how to conduct business and how to execute on building one specific type of product. And the amount of technical expertise that they may have, there are many situations where that sort of heritage database of information winds up sort of supplementing the technical expertise of the team so that you need less actual technical expertise in the team because they have all of this data that they can go back and rely on. Well, that's great when we're doing what we've always been doing, but when we need to do something different, we now have less PhDs. We now have less people who know how to invent and do new things, and so a pivot is harder. On top of all of that, the sheer magnitude of debt that a lot of these bigger companies have, most of these bigger companies like to see some form of leverage. They don't want to be running purely on cash. They like to have a little bit of debt because for a couple of different governance reasons, but pivoting while saddled by debt is really hard because you have much less leeway when it comes to revenues. So getting to some of the revenues here, Hughes was carrying roughly $100 million in cash at the end of quarter one, and their loan came due and they needed to pay off $1.5 billion. Just a casual 15x difference. Nothing big here, but the trends, like their revenue was down about 4% year over year in line with expectations. They absolutely outperformed Q2 year over year, posting a roughly a 50 million sort of net income this year over a 300 million loss from last year. due to operations. They actually reported a profit of $8.5 billion, but that reported profit is largely due to them gaining almost $10 billion on deconsolidation and divesting. Effectively, sort of to what you were saying earlier, EchoStar and a lot of the big incumbents in Geo have been looking at their portfolio of product lines and business lines and deciding which to keep and which to trim. And so EchoStar has sold off a lot. They sold off a lot of spectrum. They sold off a lot of different assets, and they were able to post a pretty big profit as a result of that. But their fundamental operations are still shrinking. They're still over-indexed towards a shrinking consumer base and a shrinking customer base. And the lay of the land makes their incumbent business model harder to succeed at. So this is certainly not going to be the last of the sort of changes that we see EchoStar executing towards. The bankruptcy that they're experiencing here, Hughes Network is claiming that this will not impact EchoStar or any of EchoStar's other subsidiaries that are still in operations as they go through this, but we'll have to see how the debtors wind up litigating and pursuing against that.
Onto the rockets, we have a pretty interesting setback for lunar travel. We have a Falcon 9 upper stage colliding with the moon. So this Falcon 9 upper stage was used to launch Firefly's Blue Ghost lander a few years back. You know, when they do missions that go that far out, they use up all their fuel getting there. So this second stage was orbiting in an unstable lunar orbit for a while now. And it was intended to kind of stay in that spot so that it didn't interfere with anything. They did a couple burns to kind of keep it outside of the moon's orbit, but according to some of these reports, they're saying that solar weather and some gravity perturbations caused the second stage to kind of deorbit into the moon. So NASA had said they were going to use a couple of their orbiters to try to watch for this collision. There's some footage of it. It's not the most exciting thing, but it is pretty crazy to see, something hitting the moon. For obvious reasons, you don't want that to happen. For now, it's not a huge deal. I mean, it kicks up some dust, puts some debris into space. It would take a long time for that debris to come back to Earth, although it eventually will. But I think the bigger issue is that we're trying to colonize the moon, and when you have stuff hitting it unexpectedly, that puts everybody at risk. It puts assets at risk. Eventually, hopefully, people not hopefully at risk, but that's the challenge. I think it would be good to look at this and try to figure out a way to better kind of dispose of lunar rockets, because once we start putting stuff on the moon, we don't want rockets coming down on top of their heads. I think this is I hope that this is a boon for like in-space infrastructure and refueling. I know part of the core technology for lunar habitation is refueling. So, hopefully once that kind of becomes a thing, this isn't an issue anymore. But it's certainly unfortunate that this had to happen. I would ideally like stuff to not hit the moon. It's not great.
I think that what's most interesting here is the idea that sort of second stage rocket was effectively in a graveyard orbit, sort of around the moon, that it was supposedly in a stable, sort of safe orbit. It had been there for over a year since the Blue Ghost launch back in, I want to say January of 25. The point here is that anything in a graveyard orbit crashing down to the surface of the moon is bad news. In this case, the graveyard orbit lasted for about 15 months. So sort of to your point, I'm pretty concerned that this is indicative of a sort of a false assumption that we may have made that, you can use this. This will be a reliable sort of graveyard orbit. This is a reasonable sort of logistical solution to getting mass to the moon and leaving sort of second stages there. Because the explanation was effectively solar flux and gravitational perturbations, which okay, great. That doesn't really answer any of the questions here. doesn't really help solve things. So, the question then becomes, okay, well, so how do we prevent this? I think the proposed solution of extensive orbital and lunar infrastructure is good. I would be perfectly happy if we had a literal graveyard, like on the North Pole or something.
But if we launch it into Mars instead,
you know what I mean? If we just decided like, okay, hey, we're done. This is where we're going to crash it. Like I'd be perfectly fine with that for now, though obviously longer term, that's not a solution. But my much bigger concern is going out of our way to eliminate any risk of an unintended or accidental deorbit of something. I would much rather, if we're going to have something floating around and orbiting the moon, I would much rather have part of its ConOps and part of its mission cycle involve a planned disposal. Here, there, wherever it is. But I would much prefer to see that. I think that's probably going to be a shorter path to success than getting lunar refueling up and running. But lunar refueling would undoubtedly be the better long-term solution.
Yeah, they might want to take a note from Blue Origin on disposing of their rockets, although maybe wait until after the rocket's off the pad, because Blue Origin's still investigating the explosion of their New Glenn rocket a couple months back. They found what they believe to be the root cause of that issue to be an oxygen valve on their BE-4 engine. So this caused a catastrophic explosion of their rocket during a static test fire, knocked out most of the launch pad, although they're moving to refurbish it quite quickly. I think this investigation will be one of the bigger setbacks for them. We've talked about it recently, like valves are always a struggle. They seem to make up a majority of the failures for rockets. It's unfortunate. I mean, it's unfortunate that this happened. I guess it's fortunate that they caught it during a test. And they're talking about redesigning the nozzle. They think they can fix it without having to replace the part. So that's somewhat promising, although, I would think they would want to test it again before launching. So that makes it a significant setback. I think the other interesting thing to note is that the ULA Vulcan also uses this engine. And that is not helpful for them. They're already reeling from their double failure with their solid boosters. Maybe this is just an issue that hadn't popped up yet with their BE-4. I imagine they're happy to know about it before it happened to them, but it couldn't come at a worse time for them. I think it will just add to their setbacks as well. But at least they isolated the problem. They did make a note that it might be just one of multiple problems. So I think they're still going through their investigation, which even a further setback. But, hopefully this is the only issue and they find a fix that, actually fixes it permanently.
Bad day at the office for the BE-4 engine, but Dave Lemp, CEO of Blue Origin, he's seemed pretty confident that they've identified the problem here. I think that, sort of to your point, I think there's likely multiple things contributing to the problem that we saw and the failure of the valve or the valve nozzle more specifically. As CEO, his job is to convey confidence and is to help lead forward. So it's not at all surprising that he would say, hey, here's sort of the clear path forward. But they're optimistic that they're going to be able to sort of retrofit and fix everything up and be ready to launch again. I think he was quoted saying, or have the upgrades done by the end of the month for the other BE-4 engines, which still seems very ambitious as far as timeline to be. But yeah, a rough series of events for Blue Origin and the New Glenn, and cascading sort of also for ULA and the Vulcan rocket as well. But I'm optimistic that the team over there will be able to solve the problems that they need to, and will be able to get a viable solution in place.
Speaking of rough days at the office, Apex made an update on their Nova 1 spacecraft. So this is one of 4 satellites that they recently launched on board a transporter mission. Apex builds satellite buses. They have a few different kinds. So far, they've flown the Ares and the Nova. The Ares is their quote-unquote smaller bus. It's considered a small satellite, but it is relatively big. That launch flew 3 of their Ares satellites for customers. They've reported that all 3 are operating as expected, so that's good news. Fortunately, the Nova 1 bus, which is a larger bus that they're developing, has failed to make contact. So they've so far confirmed that the solar array is deployed. They confirmed that with an image from Vantor, who are able to do space-to-space imaging. So they got a clear picture that the arrays are out. They've also been able to establish, attitude, so they have some level of control. Those two facts alone should point to them being able to make contact. The only things that go wrong with radio systems are you don't get enough power, but if they have solar arrays, that shouldn't be an issue, or you can't point your antennas, which if they have control, they should be able to do. So it unfortunately sounds like they might have an issue with their radio system, or maybe the power system that supplies the radio, that's keeping them from making contact with the Nova.
Yeah, it's disappointing to see. It's disappointing to see that Apex's Nova experienced this setback, though. Congratulations to them on the success of the Ares vehicles that are up there. The Nova satellite, a little bit bigger, up to 300 kilograms of payload and rated at 1 kilowatt. Disappointing that they were not able to necessarily stick the landing. It sounds like they're still, to your point, they're still working on finding ways to sort of communicate and trying to recover it. But at the same time, it sounds like they're already sort of prepared to write it off in its entirety, that it may wind up being a total loss, which would be a disappointment. But I know that Apex is already sort of working towards and building on much bigger satellites and much bigger platforms for sort of their ambitious goals here. So I'm not entirely sure if their roadmap is, I'll say, if this is critical path for their roadmap in so many words. Like, hey, we can't launch our 5 kilowatt or our 10 kilowatt or our 100 kilowatt. We can't actually launch or make progress on that until we nail the Nova, until we feel that we've really solved the problems here. I would imagine that there's enough demand and enough momentum on the high-powered bus side of things that Apex will continue developing the 20 and 100, I believe 20 and 120 kilowatt platforms that they've been working on, regardless of the status of Ares and Nova's product development. But this setback definitely hurts. They haven't had too much actually launched yet. So Apex is valued at over $2 billion. And they simply haven't launched a whole lot of material. They simply don't have a whole lot of assets that have gone up. So the fact that their first Nova is a setback hits a little bit harder than it would have been if they had a really robust track record of success with the Ares. They're a smart and talented team, and I'm sure they'll be able to figure out what went wrong. Sort of to your point, it did sort of sound like maybe it was a problem specifically in the comms system. We'll have to see what winds up being sort of the root cause, and whether this is more of a sort of design failure or a like component and part failure. Couple of interesting things that we get to talk about before we get to the lightning round here. So the FCC awarded Zona Space Systems approval for a 258 LEO satellite PNT constellation. More specifically, they were big picture approved for this constellation, but the actual approval covers the first 16 spacecraft that will go up initially. And then once those spacecraft go up initially, there's going to be another round of approval that's effectively based on an updated orbital debris assessment. That second round is going to be much less sort of rigorous than the first round. So it's more of a formality than anything else, but it's still, you need to do the orbital debris assessment and make sure that, okay, everything is actually going to line up well and everything is going to be copacetic here. The do or die dates for Zona Space is a 50% deployment by July of 2032 and a 100% deployment by July of 2035. They are on track to launch the first 6 of their 16 spacecraft in October, launching 6 Pulsar satellites. And they're scaling out their manufacturing team in Burlingame, California to deliver on that. Now, the Pulsar is designed to broadcast effectively an L-band signal. It's proprietary. This is their secret sauce, but they're effectively going to be broadcasting signal adjacent to existing GPS communiques, which enable it to integrate with most GNSS infrastructure, which also enables them to provide a lot of redundancy and a lot of backup for potentially jammed GNSS assets. So big picture, Zona is seeking to build out a privately operated alternative or supplement to the incumbent sort of government-owned navigation constellations that operate primarily from MEO. The Zona platform is going to be all LEO and is going to involve that adjacency proprietary signal that will provide a lot of redundancy for GNS, PNT, and otherwise potentially sensitive communications and important data.
I mean, 6 years to deploy, it feels like plenty of time. It's for 125 roughly satellites. So, that's not nothing, but they are actively building out their production floor. They're building it out this year. I think they're trying to get to like 20, 30 satellites per year, which should put them on track. I think it's cutting it a bit close, but they can ramp up to that, I'm sure, or ramp beyond it to adjust. I do find it like a oddly difficult business, it seems. Like we've been talking about Amazon Leo and how they had to reach, hundreds of satellites before they could start operating their constellation. And they had the money to kind of just support development along the way. I am curious if Zona is able to kind of start offering services before they reach 50%, because there's a lot of money to put, like a lot of CapEx to start building hundreds of satellites for a service that can't make money yet. And beyond that, like once you get those 250 up, I don't think they need to keep producing satellites. So they've built this production capability that kind of goes dormant once they do start collecting money. So it just feels like a very difficult business to kind of be generating money and creating satellites kind of out of sync with each other. I would be interested to see if they kind of come up with another like product after Pulsar, but I don't know, the GPS kind of market is a very particular niche that I don't think there's like some next generation capability they could kind of implement. So I think it is a necessary technology. I think their approach to it's very good and unique. And I think it does solve a lot of the problems we're talking about with like GPS jamming and stuff. But there's a lot of other solutions that are being pursued that might have lower CapEx or rollout timelines that might put some pressure on them to kind of deliver. So the FCC deadline, it's kind of been a lot of talk because we talk about Leo and the strictures it places on that and kind of the emphasis it's placing on launch capability, which will be a whole other problem they'll have to deal with. But I think that the bigger issue is just going to be them having the runway to kind of get up to operation and then sustain that in a way that's, paying off long term. Because I could see things like we've talked with a number of alternative PNT solution companies out there. Like Lasercom to me seems like the biggest risk to this business model. If we get laser space to earth working and these APNT systems can come up with solutions that can't be jammed because it's light based, then it kind of eats into the sector that Zona is pursuing. So I just see the timeline as all sorts of difficult, between regulatory, between launch, between production, between operational timeline, between competitors and a relatively small niche. I mean, it's big enough that they could be profitable, but it's just like it doesn't expand out into a lot of other kind of sectors, like things like communications or observation can do.
The manufacturing needs for a project like this. To your point, they're going to need to get 258 LEO satellites up by 2035. So if we just assume sort of straight line that they're going to get them up in that straight line time, and then we assume some sort of rate of depreciation of these assets, we're completely ignoring the aspect of them needing to hit sort of the minimum threshold in order to actually start providing services here. So that's another aspect that one would need to factor in. But effectively, what their goal here is undoubtedly going to be to maintain sort of a constant or steady throughput of satellites that, every quarter they're going to need to make, I'll say 5 new satellites to replace 5 satellites that have been decommissioned over the course of their orbital expected lifetime. But to your point, that means that you're just sort of maintaining it because PNT data is is not a market that's necessarily looking for that next gen or next wave sort of product or capability that suddenly doubles or triples the TAM, right? It's a pretty straightforward, hey, this is what it does. And to your point, a lot of the other substitute solutions out there actually solve the same problem in a way that represents sort of a threat to the underlying market. So I would not expect Zona to be, I would not expect them to be focused exclusively on the GPS market. I would expect them to leverage their L-band signal for the GPS market, because that is sort of the lowest hanging fruit. There has been a trend of, I'll say, government subsidies or subsidized satellite constellations being sort of defunded and decommissioned. We've seen that with sort of a lot of the weather satellites, with a lot of NOAA satellite imagery, with a lot of information that needs to be put together, that the U.S. government has previously footed the bill for by owning the satellites themselves. And that has sort of shifted to the private market with like Tomorrow.io and other companies, right? So their bigger picture sort of strategy and plan could very well be like, oh, well, we think the same sort of trend is going to happen in the GPS market. We think we're going to see a lot of different folks and a lot of different governments wind up effectively divesting from the GPS geo assets themselves. A lot of the incumbents solutions operate in MEO, which is a little bit harder to do. So if they're able to solve this at a more competitive price point, and if they're able to solve this more capital efficiently than some of the incumbents, I wouldn't be super surprised to see them sort of winning some sizable renewal contracts or P&T contracts that effectively age out and sunset some of the existing solutions there. But yeah, outside of that sort of, I'll say, government capture environment, there is some competitive risk, and there's some downward pressure on the market a little bit. They've got to go quickly enough to establish themselves, and they've got to go quickly enough to make revenue and prove out that their technology works, their business model closes, and that they are a viable candidate for all of the capabilities that they purport to offer. At the same time, they've got to go capital efficiently enough that they're not effectively raising hundreds of millions of dollars to just throw away on all of this basically sort of initial CapEx cost. So they've got to thread the needle and find a way to do this sustainably enough to where they're able to survive sort of a potential demand shock. Neurospace raised $18 million for space situational awareness and space traffic management. The Portuguese firm announced the funding to expand European SDA and SSA defense capabilities in their Series B round. This round includes €6 million from private capital and almost €10 million from Portugal's Recovery and Resilience Plan, which is the same sort of COVID-19 relief plan from which we've seen Poland deploying capital for their own space efforts. So multiple countries and multiple players in the European space market are leveraging these recovery funds for their own space sovereignty efforts. And the funding will directly support Neurospace Defense, which is an AI-powered dual-use SDA platform for both government and defense users. I think probably most impactfully, Redwire has signed with SpaceX's Starfall to fly 32 drug labs to eclipse the entire ISS program in a single flight. SpaceMD, Redwire's pharmaceutical subsidiary, has signed a commercial contract for a dedicated Starfall mission. They've locked in 32 of their pillbox drug crystallization units for a 2028 flight. I have a lot of thoughts on this, but I want to pause so that and let you really go here, Harrison. But what do you think, Batman?
I mean, I think it's great. I think it's a great anchor customer for Starfall. Redwire has one of the longest kind of histories with in space manufacturing. They acquired Made in Space like a decade ago at this point. Not quite that long ago, but like it was half a decade. Anyway, they bought Made in Space. That gives them some in-space manufacturing capability. They've since been flying these pillboxes on the ISS. So it's got a lot of heritage. More than anything else, like we've talked about a number of different in-space manufacturing companies, and most of them kind of have to build up forges or labs for their specific product that they're trying to produce. Very few of them have flown. Of the ones that have flown, all of them have been on ISS. Yeah, that's not to set Redwire apart that much because there's also have only flown the ISS, but they've done it at a volume that gives them a lot of experience with this sort of thing. So I think it helps a lot kind of jumpstart Starfall's logistics management, giving them a platform or a payload that's already been tested so they know that works. And so I think it's a really great kind of repurposing of existing hardware. Like Starfall is just the heat shield from a Dragon capsule repurposed into a in-space manufacturing platform. Then Redwire goes and takes their pillbox, pulls it off the ISS, puts it on this platform. It's a marrying of two pretty mature technologies to create a whole new class of spacecraft. So yeah, I think it's not something we see very often. It's not like a whole new sector pops out of an existing sector because most of the sectors in space aren't that level of maturity. I mean, even the ones that are mature, like Geocom, it's not like Leocom popped out of that. It's that it came to supplant that. So I think it's a really interesting kind of confluence of capabilities to basically create a whole new business out of this. So yeah, I think this will help. Redwire can foot some of the bill. SpaceX obviously can foot some of the bill. They can prove out that they can do this at scale. That will give a strong signal to other consumers, which are mostly businesses in sectors outside of space, that this is now a viable option. So I think this is great. It will help clear some of the risk out of the sector and lead the way for more people to kind of enter it and pursue it as a real business. I think in that way, it is going to benefit the industry as a whole. So it's not just Starfall is going to eat all of the business. I think they're going to take a majority of it, but leave enough over for other companies like Varda, like Lux Aeterna that want to come in and play in the same sector as well. So overall, I just read this as a great sign.
I think that life for everybody who has been building and playing in the microgravity manufacturing, in the down mass, in the space logistics industry, I think life just got a lot harder for all of those folks. Net, I tend to agree with you. I think that it is still a positive sign for the industry. It is a sort of a simple solution to a problem that folks have been trying to solve for a little while. In-orbit manufacturing, microgravity manufacturing has been a market that's been on the horizon for about a decade at this point, and this represents sort of the coming out party, if you will, or the arrival of that industry. This is, to my knowledge, sort of like the first major commercial contract signed for microgravity manufacturing, which is great, but it does so in a way that effectively already establishes, hey, here is the already sort of winner take most leader in the market. For folks looking to break into this market as other space logistics or microgravity manufacturing providers, there is now a massive competitor that they've got to go up with. So, just from the quick breakdown here, we're just going to assume that SpaceX is going to take a cost leadership position, because why wouldn't they? So SpaceX is going to wind up providing the most cost-effective solution out there, which means if you're going to be competing with SpaceX, it means that you need to do something that SpaceX is not able to do, which more or less means that you're needing to provide some sort of differentiated or bespoke service that you're able to charge more for. And so, with Lux Aeterna, that's very clear. Hey, like the whole satellite, the whole bus, you're able to do. You don't just need the payload, or you don't just need the microgravity manufacturing. There's a whole bunch more down mass that we can do. and arguably Lux Eterna themselves are not actually in the microgravity or the space logistics business. They're in the refurbished satellite business. For folks like Varda, for folks like BioOrbit, and for Space Phoenix, other folks that we've spoken with, the calculus gets a little bit different, and so Starfall isn't about to go around and, to my knowledge, try to do a whole bunch of logistics solutions, moving people from point A to point B. It seems to be much more straightforward about providing the platform for the pharmaceutical research to be conducted, and then providing the space for that, and then returning that mass, most importantly. So there's still going to be other slices of the market, but whatever, if you're out there trying to play in this space, if you're out there trying to create a space logistics or a microgravity manufacturing startup, you're out there effectively selling a total available market. You're out there selling, this market is $10 trillion big, however big it is, right? Investors now seeing that, SpaceX has already won this market, investors are now going to take whatever that TAM is and knock it down by an order of magnitude or two. So life did just get a lot harder for some of the folks looking to play in the market. But net, this does very much validate the market. It matures the market and proves that it is there. It's no longer theoretical. So it may be a little bit harder for folks to get funding and to get more speculative investment, but the folks who are able to raise some capital and are able to start executing on that will be able to do so with a definite customer base like there and waiting for them. On to the lightning round for the day. Just a couple of business moves. The first of which is that Capella Space, Umbra Space, and ICEYE all won National Reconnaissance Office contracts for radar data. These new contracts were awarded to the 3 SAR providers and is effectively sold as a significant step towards supplementing operational data for integration with the NRO's own classified ISR birds. These contracts have a 1-year performance baseline and include 2 optional follow-on years that would conclude on July 31st, 2029 if executed. And it represents the first of several efforts to help the Commercial Systems Program Office transition study contracts into new radar commercial augmentation contract vehicles based on a rigorous set of requirements. So the way that I'm reading this is that these contracts are effectively sort of a pre-selection for the 3 proven partners, three of the leaders in SAR, to be sort of brought on and fast-tracked for those RCA contract vehicles that we would expect to materialize in the near future.
Yeah, it is fairly unique compared to some of the other NRO contracts in that it's for SAR. Like we saw a number of these earlier in the year, but they were picking up mostly like infrared imager and visible optics. And then those contracts, a lot of them were awarded to international customers. So even though NRO is a U.S. Government entity, it's interesting to see them, willing to purchase images from anywhere, really. It's great for Capella and Umbra. Umbra's had a better go of it than Capella with SAR, although Capella is certainly capable. It's just that they now belong to IonQ, so SAR is not their primary business anymore. But having ICEYE in the mix is kind of an endorsement of ICEYE. Not that they need it; that they're definitely doing very well. But I don't think
small indie company ICEYE.
I don't think any company, regardless of size, is going to turn down an NRO contract because just opens them to a whole new market where they can bring money in, largely contingent upon whatever projects NRO is using to kind of purchase this data. But it is interesting to see such a focus on SAR in this round. And honestly, I'm surprised Capella and Umbra weren't already approved, but it kind of reads like it's an extension upon their existing relationship. So, but that could have just been, like you pointed out, these were more like studies rather than like a commercial kind of relationship. So good maturity here. I think the NRO is going to continue adding more and more Earth observation companies to the list of vendors they can buy from. which is, good. I think there's a kind of a new wave going through Earth observation, and it's good to see the NRO is kind of supporting that.
Additionally, Seraphim Space, the Seraphim Space Investment Trust, committed 21 million pounds to Pixel and Xeno Power. So 25 million US into Pixel, the hyperspectral imaging company, and 3.5 million US to Xeno Power, the nuclear power developer. Both of these businesses are existing portfolio holdings. So Seraphim already has them on their books, and it sort of follows with the thesis that they've been executing towards of following on with the proven leaders in the industry rather than sort of abiding by the power law and taking as many shots on goal as possible, taking shots and sticking with them sort of to the end. This is the first capital that they've deployed. It's the first money out of SSIT's 137 million pound C share raise that they did, I believe, earlier in the year. So interesting to see that capital being deployed and to see Seraphim starting to put some pen to paper here.
Yeah, kind of crazy spread on companies here. Like Pixel doing Earth observation couldn't get any more traditional of a space application, and then Xeno being nuclear, which hasn't flown in any meaningful quantity commercially. So it's cool to see a VC that's willing to take such wild bets, but I think the numbers kind of reflect the conviction on certain technologies. Pixel has a track record. Their plan is to develop imaging platforms that are more leveraging edge AI and doing more traditional kind of space applications, whereas I think Xeno is positioned well to capitalize on some of this development around lunar nuclear technology, but they are dual use in the sense that they're operating in a bunch of other industries as well. I do think it's interesting that Seraphim, being a very space-focused company, is willing to invest in a company that's arguably not primarily space-focused. So I think it's good. I think there's a number of space companies, or I think there's a number of nuclear companies out there that are recognizing the potential value of space nuclear and setting aside some effort to develop for that. Lastly, for today, we have our tech advance, which is that SpaceX has announced their intent to acquire 130,000 acres of marshland in Louisiana. This is to develop a launch base, likely just for their Starship. That Starship only launches out of Texas right now, down in Boca Chica. I think they had plans to launch out of Cape Canaveral, but I'm guessing they're seeing how well it's working to have their own launch site and just want to have another to increase capacity. I think this is in anticipation, because Starship isn't operational yet, of them having a much faster launch cadence. And Louisiana is an interesting choice. I would have thought maybe they could get more land in Texas. Like, getting it in Louisiana doesn't really change their latitude much. So I don't see the benefit necessarily, other than that's the only place they could get so much land. Does seem risky given the hurricane history with Louisiana for operations out of there, but maybe it came in cheap. I also think the location in terms of launch corridors is kind of tricky, because you're going to be launching over Florida. Although I don't know if they care all that much about you launching over Florida. If they do, however, you're going to have to do some sort of dogleg maneuver to go around Florida, which is going to cost them in fuel efficiency. But given that Starship's meant to be refuelable and kind of usher in a whole new generation of infrastructure capability, I think that they might be a little more resilient to that hit on efficiency. So I think it's an interesting choice. I think it's interesting timing too, although it's going to take a while to build it up. So I guess they have to get started now, even before they've reached the cadence necessary to have 2 launch sites. But I love seeing SpaceX take big bets on Starship. It's promising that they think Starship will be operational soon, and they'll need all the launch capacity they can get.
So SpaceX is effectively acquiring 130,000 acres of condemned land. There've been looking into it a little bit. There's been a series of suits and a series of coastal action committees and suits against ExxonMobil, claiming that Exxon basically poisoned and destroyed the land by their operation or use of the land. And so SpaceX is pretty clearly getting sort of a good deal on the land itself, and there is some legislative and regulatory momentum to sort of helping grease the wheels on that and helping them get through whatever sort of regulatory hurdles there may be in order to stand up an additional launch site. So the FAA actually proposed a couple of rule changes that would allow them to basically bypass a whole bunch of environmental protection laws and some regulatory hurdles about flight restrictions as well for folks looking to launch rockets. So there's definitely some legislative tailwinds and some regulatory tailwinds. There's definitely some folks looking to help SpaceX get additional launch sites up and help them succeed. To your point, I don't think functionally there's a huge difference between Texas and Louisiana as far as latitude goes, as far as orbit inclination, and as far as the actual operations of things go. I think this is more about being able to move quickly and being able to rapidly try and rapidly stand up additional capacity and additional launch capability. So I'd be willing to bet that the reason they're not pursuing an additional site nearby in Texas is that they think that this is a quicker path to additional launch capacity. Well, that is a wrap for the week's recap of the space industry. We hope you enjoyed the episode. As always, please drop us a comment, check out our socials, and follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Substack, or wherever you're receiving this signal. Until next time, this is Paul Mayer and Harrison Lambert signing off for now.